Thanks, Lara, and thanks, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today and to be part of this. I can't believe what a huge conference it is, and so amazing to see everyone together. I wish lots of my patients in London would be able to come as well, because I'm sure you're getting a lot from this. So I was watching the song just earlier, and I thought, wow, what a great introduction to my presentation, because I think what they said just summed up so much of what patients with EDS go through. So today I'm going to talk a bit about maybe how to cope with some of the difficulties emotionally that going through chronic symptoms does to one. I'll be talking for half an hour, and then we will have 15 minutes at the end when I'd love to answer your questions or listen to any observations you've got. So no disclosures, just a thank you to the rest of the psychology team. We're part of the London Hypermobility Unit, work with the physios and the rest of the healthcare professional team there. And we see patients directly in clinic, and we also have Skype sessions with patients from all over the world as well. So we work a lot with patients with EDS. So today I want to talk partly a bit about what it's like from a psychological perspective, and certainly what all the research says about some of the dilemmas of living with chronic health problems, which of course you will know about yourselves very deeply, and with EDS specifically. I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of EDS on mental and emotional well-being that we find in our patients, and also think a bit about pain processing and some of the factors that influence both pain and fatigue. And think a bit about how psychology can help. So what I'd love from today is, even if some people just go back with a few ideas you can try yourself, at the end I've included a list of different resources you can access. So I think, you don't always have to be having therapy for psychology to be useful. There's lots of ways in which we can access it nowadays. So chronic health issues is very different to an acute episode of something that gets sorted out fairly easily. You know how long you're going to have it for, what medication you take, and that's it. A chronic health issue is, of course, completely different. So some of the things that have been found over the years are both just the stress of the diagnosis journey. We hear time and time again, unfortunately, from our patients who either EDS was ignored, minimised, misdiagnosed. Often they're told it's all in their head, and that's always something that it's really important for us to address when we first meet them, and actually talk about how we're trying to help them with the effect of the symptoms on their life. We are in no way saying that their issues are psychological. We're just saying actually it's really hard to be having a chronic health issue. But unfortunately for many patients, they've been told that it's psychological, which is actually a way of dismissing them. So partly that I think there's trauma around that, there's lots of anxiety around that. So that's one of the things I'll talk about today. Also sort of socializing, getting used to living with chronic health problems is one part of part of the issue for people, how you can get used to managing certain things just from a practical point of view, how you live with uncertainty. I think that's one of the biggest problems with chronic health issues, not knowing how you'll be one day. You might have quite a good day, but then unpredictably, maybe you'll have a flare-up and all the plans you've made for that day or week go. So I think psychologically, uncertainty is very hard. And how to negotiate different adjustments in your role, in expectations of yourself, in other people's expectations of you, what you do as a partner, what you do as a parent, an employee, all of those things take huge adjustments. And how to maintain an identity that's not just about illness, that actually might be about doing something that's really fun to you or really important to you. And as psychologists, that's something we work on a lot with people, that how they can have something, how they can stop the illness taking over too much of their life. Are there some areas they can take back for themselves? And obviously there are specific challenges in different subtypes of EDS. There's obviously lots of overlap with these kind of symptoms, and there'll be lots that I haven't mentioned as well. But just to mention briefly some of the problems that patients talk to us about in the different subtypes. With hypermobility, it might be about managing subluxations and dislocations, the unpredictability of that, the pain of that. Classical patients will often talk about the fear of risk of injury and skin fragility. In vascular subtypes, there's obviously a lot of acute anxiety about risk to themselves, risk of doing certain activities, specific fears about pregnancy. I think for those with the very rare types, we don't see that many people with the rare types, but those we do, that I think they find the uncertainty of it really hard, and that there's not many other people that they can identify with. And then, I don't need to tell all of you all the other symptoms that you're probably having to deal with, the gastro symptoms, the mast cell activation, the POTS, and all those other things. So understandably, it's pretty hard to deal with some of the time. Now, just thinking a bit about EDS specifically and emotional well-being, there's been research on hypermobility EDS and emotional well-being, but not really very much on the other subtypes at present. I hope that will change. So there's been a link found between anxiety disorders and hypermobility EDS. And one meta-analysis that reviewed lots of papers found that those with benign joint hypermobility syndrome in sort of standardized testing experience greater perceptions of fear, more intense fear. They're more likely to be agoraphobic and be fearful of leaving the house, more likely to have anxiety and panic disorders, and there may be a link to depression as well. And they think that the reason for this is genetic risks, making them more likely to have anxiety, autonomic nervous system dysfunction, so the same system that gets activated in POTS is the anxiety system. Even though people aren't anxious, POTS will get triggered for a different reason, but it's all working on the same kind of systems. And also there's some really important research coming out about, this is about a bit of a jargon and a bit of a mouthful, but increased exteroceptive, which means being more aware of sensations outside of yourself, and increased interoceptive mechanisms. So basically that just means that we think people with hypermobility, their brain may turn up the volume on both sensations outside of them. It might be noise, it might be temperature, it might be danger, threat, and also internally interoceptive, that they may feel increased sensations with anxiety. They may have an increased heart rate and be more aware of it, for example. So they did a study where they looked at brain activity when presenting negative emotional stuff to people. And those with hypermobility were more likely they had a stronger reaction in the brain to the negative emotional stimuli. And that's not something anyone is doing on purpose, that is just literally how their brain is working. Their brain is turning up the volume for them. So we think this is one of the things that makes it harder for people with hypermobility, or EDS. Not only are they coping with all these different symptoms, issues, impact on their life, they are actually feeling it in a stronger way. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. Also, my colleague, Dr. Chad Shepherd, will be talking tomorrow about trauma and PTSD and EDS, so catch that if you can tomorrow, because there's a lot of work coming out about the effect of trauma on the body physically, and living with EDS is hugely traumatic. Often people talk to me about the experiences they've been through. As I mentioned at the beginning, the not being believed, the being misdiagnosed. So that's something to bear in mind, all of these things people are having to cope with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pain. And these are just a few examples, the red circles, of the way pain can affect your life. It can affect your activity levels, which in turn will affect your muscle strength and then your stamina, which in turn will increase pain. It can, of course, affect your sleep, your anxiety levels. All of these things are natural consequences of pain. Every one of us would feel it if we have pain. But there's been a lot of research about the science of pain and how our brain is essentially links pain to our survival system. So sometimes our brain does things to help us understand and deal with pain that isn't always helpful to us when it's chronic pain. It's one thing when it's acute, one-off, but when it's chronic. So there's a very well-known pain researcher in Australia called Lorimer Moseley. He'd researched pain for years, knew everything about it. And one day he was walking along in the bush and he felt a rustle at his ankles and he just thought, it's just a plant, no big deal. And then shortly afterwards he was in acute pain and it was a really dangerous snake that had bitten him. He was rushed to hospital, just about made it in time, survived. A couple of years later, he was walking again in the bush, felt a rustle at his ankle, and experienced acute pain exactly like the time the snake bit him. And he looked down and it was just a plant. And that was his brain saying, where's my memory of when I last felt this sensation in this context, in this place? Oh, it must be the snake again. I better send a warning message down. So I think that's just one example of how pain can sometimes get things wrong and send us unhelpful messages. So what we know, some of the things we know about pain is the amount of pain we get, the intensity, the quality of it is influenced by things like our previous experiences. You know, if you've had lots and lots of chronic pain, and sometimes when it's just been overwhelming, your brain is probably going to increase that pain message, the volume. Whether we understand what is causing the pain. So I think it's really difficult for patients, before they really know what the pain is, it's very difficult for them to be able to cope with it easily, because they're imagining all sorts of things that it could be. The consequences, you know, if on a Sunday night you're having a lot of pain and you know it might stop you going to school or going to work, you're probably going to be quite anxious about it. It's natural. And our beliefs about pain as good or bad. They did some interesting research looking at religion and pain, and the idea being that in Catholicism, pain is often seen as suffering and has some positive aspects to it. And they looked at a Catholic group of people and a non-religious group of people, and they showed them a picture of the Virgin Mary and a picture of a woman who just looked like her. And they electric shock, so I hope they got paid well for it, but they all had the same level of pain. And the Catholic group had a reduced pain response when they saw the Virgin Mary. They didn't have a reduced pain response to the woman who just looked like her, and the non-religious group didn't have a reduced pain response either. So I just think it's one of the things, I'm going to talk in a moment, some of the things to bear in mind with EDS and pain, that our brain can sometimes try to do things that aren't helpful for us and increase the pain. So the brain basically uses various things to decide what to do about pain. So when a pain message will go up to different bits of the brain, including the emotional bit of the brain, the thinking bit of the brain, the memory bit, the sensory bit, all of those things we need to have for survival, and then our brain will decide what to do about it. And obviously it's one thing if you've been to the gym, you haven't got health issues, you've just exercised really hard, and you know, you're in pain for a couple of days. That's really easy for your brain to think about. You know it's going to go soon. You know actually it's a sign your body's getting stronger. It's very easy to move on from it. However, if you've got chronic pain that's unpredictable, that is really affecting your life, that's a different matter to cope with. So this slide is about what we focus on and the effect of pain. So in this example, the same person given an electric shock again, and in the first slide with all the colour on it, he was asked to focus all his attention on the pain. And you can see that the colours are, there's more colours, there's more, a bigger area which shows there's more heat. So basically he is experiencing more pain, there's more activity in the brain there. And in the second example with a small blue sort of blob in the middle, he was asked to focus all his attention on some music. And you can see how the pain is reduced in that. Now, I'm not pretending that if you just distract yourself, you won't feel pain. I've worked with patients for long enough with chronic pain to know that. But I just think this is all important to bear in mind in terms of some of the things our brains can do to either help us or not help us. And I'll be explaining more how this works in practice a bit more with patients. So really, it's often thought that pain is the brain's best guess about what's going on in the world. You know, I've had people who have had really traumatic dislocations, you know, an ambulance not come for an hour and a half, and since then they've been experiencing much more intense pain because their brain is also worried about pain, turning up the volume. And I think one thing to bear in mind is EDS is such a misunderstood diagnosis. People can be blamed, disbelieved, and that in itself leads to fear, which also can increase pain. So one of the ways in which we work to help people is through cognitive behaviour therapy, so CBT, that some of you may have heard of this. And it really just, if you can't see the colours in those boxes, it basically says emotions, thoughts, behaviours and body sensations, and how all these can just be linked together. So for some people thinking that they're going to damage themselves if they do certain physio exercises would naturally lead to them feeling anxious and not doing the physio exercises, which also would have a real effect on their physical rehabilitation. And so we work with people to just, first of all, just understand what is going on for them, what cycles might they be in that are helpful or unhelpful, what would they like to change, how can we help them with that. Some of the research about pain management programs using CBT, the British Pain Society recommends it as the treatment of choice. It's been found to reduce distress, what we call catastrophizing, thinking worst case scenario about pain, improve people's pain experience, activity levels. It doesn't always take away pain or reduce it, but for lots of people, they'll say that they just feel more able to cope with pain, that they're doing more despite it, that they're getting stronger, and it's less stressful. It's not affecting their sleep as much, all of these knock-on effects. So some of the factors that we know from research and from our work with patients that can increase pain and fatigue, and also all the other kinds of symptoms as well, is avoiding activity. Understandably, when you're in pain, you don't want to move. The problem is that this has a knock-on effect that people become deconditioned and lose strength and have more pain. Also, our brain will just naturally get us to guard different bits of our body. So you might find you have a problem in your left knee and then it transfers to your right because your right is trying to compensate, and that leads to lots of biomechanical changes as you move. And this is nothing that anybody is doing on purpose. It's just the way our brains try to do things to help us. And the more we don't do stuff and activity, the more also we might get low in mood sometimes, completely natural. Boom and bust, that's something I'm going to talk in more detail about because I think it's extremely important. Pain focus, as you saw from those brain scans, if we're focusing on pain a lot because it's so hard to cope with, that can just increase pain intensity, lead to us doing less, affect our mood and anxiety. I know when I work with kids, parents will report feeling helpless, guilty, frustrated. They can't help their child with the pain in the way they want. And pain is being talked about a lot of the time. And one of the things we might say to the family is like, okay, once a week, talk about pain. Also, you start using the word comfort. How can you get yourself more comfortable? Even that is a suggestion to the brain. It's really natural to be talking about it or thinking about it. But if we just go back to that brain scan and the effect it has on us thinking about pain, it's just going to be taking over more than people might want it to be. We also know from lots of research that thinking worst case scenario about pain, like people can't cope, it's never going to get better, that actually increases pain intensity. We've seen it in the lab studies. This is all completely natural. Everyone would feel like this when they're in pain. But I suppose what we do is see how it may be affecting people's lives and think how it might be getting in the way of some of their goals. So things like fear of pain, feeling down, poor sleep. The more we have pain, the more we don't sleep well, the more we have pain. It's one of those cycles. So I'm just going to go quickly through some of the other slides because I'm running a bit out of time and I want to have time to talk through some actual examples of techniques. So these are just some of the beliefs which can make pain worse, really, really understandable beliefs. Things like, I need to wait for the pain to go before getting back to a full life, feeling hopeless it will never get better. This is an utterly human thing to feel. The problem is that it can lead to people feeling very stuck in their life, very overwhelmed. So we might look with people at how we can help them pace, and I'll talk more in a moment why we think that's so important, how we can help them cope with pain in various ways, manage stress, improve their mood, sleep, relaxation and mindful meditation. There's research out there that if you do it consistently enough for, say, like 8 weeks, you actually start to see structural changes in the brain, in the neural pathways, in terms of how pain is coped with or stress. And sometimes we might look at other psychological issues that are getting in the way. Maybe it's certain relationships, pain has made it a lot harder to deal with. Maybe it's somebody having very high expectations for themselves, and then it's really hard having to adjust those when they have pain. So thinking a bit about pacing, and the idea being that if you fill a car full of petrol, you don't wait for it to run out of petrol. You top up at the service station. Or are you trying to water your garden with an empty cup? Are you so exhausted you've used every last bit of your energy? So what we know is that periods of inactivity and not doing much, it will lead to decreases in blood volume, in the heart, increased resting heart rate, all things which make people more unfit, reduced strength in the muscles, less stability in joints, all these kind of things, which then make going about people's day even harder. So we work very closely with the physios and the medical team to help people achieve their physical goals. You know, I'm not going to tell somebody to try to do more if that's not what the physio thinks they're capable of, but if there are things getting in the way of trying to work towards those goals, then we want to try to help them achieve it. So some of the benefits of pacing are, I suppose, having more stability, less flare-ups, feeling a bit more in control of your body. Now this slide I got a bit of a laugh at earlier because it's about boom and bust, and that's probably the most common activity cycle people find themselves in. Sometimes it might be overactivity, sometimes underactivity chronically, but boom and bust I would say is the most common one because people just want to live their lives. They want to do as much as they can. And so those spikes you see going upwards, they're the spikes of activity, but then it's too much for their body, and then they crash. They might crash for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, start to feel a bit better, start to do a bit more, and then they crash again. And the problem is, if you can see that red downward line, the trend is, with the boom and bust cycle, to be able to do less and less over time. And actually, we, along with the physios, work on, okay, well, how could you go up that little staircase? How could you get that increased trend, that black line, more of that over time? And so there's a bit of a formula. I didn't make this up, but this is what lots of health professionals use, is take what you do roughly, take what you do on a bad day, add them together, and then just take the average of minus 20%. So you don't have a calculator with you all the time. You take a walk, I get that. But the idea is that you're do what you can do on a bad day, a good day too. So you're holding back on a good day, and it might be yourself on a bad day. It might be on a bad day saying, I feel awful, I'm in so much pain, exhausted, but I'm going to do a 5-minute walk, and in 3 hours' time, I'll do another 5-minute walk. So you might be thinking of small things you can do, because ultimately that starts to help the body be able to deal more with pain, get into certain patterns of activity, increase your strength, and have so pace part. It makes lots of adjustments people probably don't want to do. Or it can be really hard to manage other expectations, symptoms. You know, unless someone's got crutches or a wheelchair, people forget that you've got EDS. They might over-sympathise with you one day and then another day just expect you to do everything. And look at your own expectations. If you have high expectations of yourself, things you want to do, it's really hard psychologically to adjust. So sometimes we might be working on quite a basic task like pacing, but actually behind it is a lot of psychological stuff. You know, I often work with people on perfectionism. It's really hard to be a perfectionist when you've got pain, and it often leads to crashes and flare-ups. And trying to help people understand that and be kind to themselves, be compassionate, be realistic with what their body can do. And that's hard. There's lots of losses in that. I think there's grief in that. I don't think people get their heads around that overnight. It takes time. And I suppose we see our job as therapists as people often talk about therapy as holding the mirror up to somebody with them. So we're on their side, looking at all of these kind of issues with them, saying, I know this is really hard. Is there anything you want to change? How would you change it? How can we help you do that? So I'm just going to talk very briefly on this, but at the end there's a reference you can look at to find out more. There's something called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is essentially all about how we can try to step back from pain, depression, anxiety, and how actually, rather than fighting those feelings sometimes, there's a lot of research for the last 20 years coming out that trying to detach ourselves from these feelings, and I'll explain how in a moment, actually leads to them passing quicker. So, went too forward. So the idea being that suffering, so the pain sensation is what we call the primary suffering, but it could be depression or sadness, for someone who doesn't have health issues. It could be anxiety. And as I've talked about, it's so natural to feel anxious about it, to feel down. If people are down, they'll frequently beat themselves up and think, why do I feel depressed? Why can't I just pull myself out of it? Other people can. If people are in pain, they'll often think, I can't cope with this, it's never going to get better. These are normal human things to think. The problem is it then takes people on what we call secondary distress, secondary suffering. The cycles last longer, they're harder to pull themselves out of it. So this approach really looks at just trying to sort of distance yourself from those thoughts and feelings and actually think about them as that might be true. You might be thinking this at this moment. It doesn't mean it's necessarily true. So I always say to people, good feelings pass. We don't feel happy and excited all day. Bad feelings pass too. Obviously, it's harder if you're in a lot of pain, but it might be the emotion associated with the pain that might pass. So there's a few, I believe all these handouts will be available afterwards. So there's a few little exercises that you can sort of work through, maybe yourselves, to have a think about. Things like thinking, sorry, go to the next one. If it's your 90th birthday and someone close to you stood up to say a few words about how you learned to manage pain or the health symptoms, what would you want to hear this person say? Now, I'm not trying to say it's easy. I absolutely know that from all my years of working with people with EDS. I think it's more about what is it you want for yourself, and is there a way, even if it's a tiny bit, even if your goal is playing a bit with your grandchildren more, or your goal is having a certain hobby or doing more at work. I think whatever is important to you, it's trying to look at pain not taking that over, or the health symptoms not taking it over. And if there's other ways to cope, not magic ways that won't work every day, but just other ways to cope. And these are just some things you can maybe look at later about ways to help you change things. And I think I use all this stuff on myself. I think this is true for everybody, all these type of patterns. Like, everyone gets stuck in cycles that aren't helpful to them. And ultimately, it's looking at them, understanding them. We talk a lot about techniques, but actually becoming aware of what patterns you're in when it comes to your thinking, your emotions, your behavior. You're halfway there already, just becoming aware of it, because so much of what we do is automatic, habitual. We fall into those kind of traps. So just thinking briefly about a case example of a young woman I worked with who'd been having pain and fatigue since 22. She came to me feeling that the anxiety was really making the pain harder, or just from a pain intensity point of view, she'd also tense up physically, so the muscle tension from anxiety led to more pain. She was also feeling really hopeless about physio, that it would work, really scared it would damage her. She's had experiences of working with physios who weren't specialists in EDS, and it had caused some damage. So this is also understandable. She also was, had very high expectations for herself. So she was caught in this boom or bust trap, and she wasn't sleeping well. And so what we worked on is, I suppose, first of all, looking at the science of pain and the pain cycle with her, and her doing a lot was leading to having more pain, and also not doing her physio. And we looked at what was important to her. I'm never going to give someone my goals for them. It always has to be their goals. And just look at what will make it easier. If you do manage to pace, what will you have to adjust to psychologically? What will you have to get your head around? How could you start doing the physio? How could you improve your sleep? Because she was finding she was really overthinking about everything at night time. That was releasing adrenaline. Her brain was, even though she was exhausted, her brain was then wide awake. And what strategies she could use. So in a moment, I'm just going to give you some references, some resources that I think are really helpful, where you can go and look at some of these things. But essentially, I think the first big thing is just recognizing what thoughts you have, what emotions you have at times when you're feeling strong negative emotions, I suppose. And are there alternatives? And why would you want there to be an alternative? Why would you want to change it? Even if you could just stop EDS affecting things by 10%, what would have to change? It might be communication with family or others. It might be that they have to do something a bit different and understand something. It might be something quite practical, like pacing. It could be anything. But I really believe, and I wouldn't do my job if I didn't, that there are always other options of coping with things for people who are feeling overwhelmed and stuck, and that nothing is helping. And sometimes, as psychologists, our job is just listening to people. They might feel that nobody understands. They've had a really difficult medical journey to get to where they are. And sometimes just being compassionate to them and validating them can be enough for them to do that for themselves. That's what we want for people to do for them. So we're very flexible about what we do for people. Everyone is different in terms of what they need. And a big thing is helping them change their behaviours, ones that are going to help them physically, help them cope with EDS as well as they can. None of this is saying it's magic or it's easy. I know I can only know from patients just how hard it can be, sometimes even just to get out of bed. And sometimes it might be just saying, you know what, that's an achievement today. The fact I fought and I got myself out of bed. I often say to people who have EDS and are being hard on themselves, I couldn't do that the same as everybody else. Yes, but imagine you're going on a hike. No one else is wearing a backpack, and you're wearing this backpack full of heavy rocks, and you got to the top. It's important to actually give yourself credit for your determination, for your survival, all of those things. And that's one of the things that can help people cope. So these are just some resources. I'm quite excited about the first one. It's Curable Health. It's a pain management subscription. There's loads of great videos and podcasts, and our patients are really raving about it. Get Self-Help is more of a general psychological site, but there's stuff on there about pain and mood and anxiety. Mood Juice is a similar one. Andrew Johnson he's a hypnosis, and he has lots of different recordings. There's one for pain, but also other types of recordings like stress. The last book is the mindfulness, which I just sort of skimmed through very quickly, the idea that we can step back from our thoughts and feelings. And actually, when we do that, the research shows that they tend to pass quicker, those thoughts, feelings, or sensations. And that book's great. It's a workbook. You can just work through one chapter at a time. It comes with a CD, very practical. So all of these I would recommend. So thank you very much for listening and for being here. And I'd love to answer any questions anyone has.
Okay. Get through. How can parents help our adult children's mental health?
How can parents help adult children?
Yeah, so.
I think so much of it is the attitude that they will convey to their children. Children, particularly younger children, but also teenage children, will get their cues from how everybody else is viewing things in the family. And, I've worked both with EDS but other sort of medical conditions over the years, and if parents are feeling completely overwhelmed and helpless and guilty, which is all 100% natural, we'd all feel like that, it's really hard for them to convey a sort of, yes, let's cope with this sort of attitude to their child. So I think for me it's about the parents getting support they need, even if that's from friends or family, and recognising what they're feeling, looking after themselves so they can do some of that for their child. And that's not to pretend that everything's fine, but just to, I suppose, helpful things for young people are allowing them to talk about their feelings, not minimizing them, not just trying to fix stuff. I was saying in my talk earlier, I think people are really bad at being okay with helplessness. I think general public find it really hard if people have a chronic health issue. They want to fix it, or they want to push it away or minimize it. And sometimes what you need is someone just to be with you in it and just say, that sounds really hard. And I think actually parents doing that for their kids is really important, as well as trying to help them. I could talk for ages about the research about kids and pain, behaviour and things, but I think actually to help children achieve their goals, get into school as much as possible, see their friends as much as possible.
Thank you. Do you think EDMR therapy is helpful for those with EDS when talking through pain?
Well, I'm going to. That's a good reminder. Thanks, Lara. My colleague, Dr. Chad Shepherd, is an expert in EMDR, and he's talking tomorrow on PTSD and trauma and EDS. So he is the man to speak to. So I would go along to that presentation because I think it's really helpful. So I'll pass that one on. Don't know that much about it. Chad's the man.
Obviously, if you're from the UK, do you recommend or know of any specific pain clinics in the US that focus more on coping mechanisms as opposed to focusing on getting off narcotics?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I don't know that much about those specific services in the US, but where do you think would be a good place for them to go to, Laura?
So we have on our website, we have a medical professionals directory, healthcare professionals directory. I think I've mentioned this a few times. And it's worth having a look at the professionals that are in your area, calling them up and speaking about the kind of services they provide and seeing if they are the right place for you to go. I think there's also, as you alluded to, a lot of online resources that are excellent these days. So I would start there and see what kind of things are in your area and do a little bit of research.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Can the brain protect the body in chronic pain by turning off the nerves in EDS, for example, functional neurologic disorder, and how can you reverse this?
Oh, that feels, I don't know that much about that specific disorder. I think, sorry, could you repeat the question, the first bit of it?
So can the brain protect the body in chronic pain by turning off the nerves in EDS?
I don't know about turning off the nerves. That's not something that I think would be the case, but certainly I think there are patterns, there are cycles. So I often think of it like turning the volume up or down. So I think there are things that can certainly turn the volume up, that, you know, the things I talked about in my presentation, and there are things that turn it down. I mean, for some people, there are some people who will do hypnosis or will do CBT or mindfulness meditation and will literally have no pain or reduced pain. I would say that's quite unusual. I think most people find that they can just cope with it better, and then it's easier to pace, and then maybe they're doing more things and they're happier. And I suppose one way to think of it is the brain, if you're doing stuff, lots of other things, the brain has got a lot of other messages going to it, and that in itself can start to block off some of the pain sensations. Whereas if you're not doing very much, isolated at home, in a lot of pain, the brain has got a lot of space just to feel that pain sensation. So that's how I would think of that question.
Can you give some tips on goal setting realistic goals on what the time frame should be, i.e. daily, weekly, yearly, etc.?
That's a really good question. I think, and also from my personal experience, don't set yourself too many goals. I know I don't achieve them if I do. Just pick one or two things to start with that are really important to you. I mean, everyone talks about SMART objectives. I'm sure you're familiar with that, but Google it if not. And, you know, it's sort of specific, it's measurable. It's not just like, I want to feel better. Like, come up with something quite specific. It's achievable, realistic, time-limited, but something also that's important to you emotionally. You know, something that, so it might not be your goal is to pace. Your goal might be to be able to spend more time with your friends and go out with them. That should be your goal. The way you get there might be pacing and doing physio and various other things, but think about something that's going to make you do it, because you're going to need that when you're trying to push through that acute discomfort and pain. You're going to have to dig deep, and so it's going to have to be something that means something to you.
Do you personally know of anyone who has EDS who's been able to greatly reduce or heal through the power of the mind or meditation, through visualization, changing one's thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I mean, children sometimes are mad like this, that sometimes I have had some, so basically the short answer is yes. I think everyone gets different things from psychology. I think for most people, the pain doesn't like just go away. It might reduce in intensity in all the ways I talked about. Their behaviours might change. But I do sometimes see some people. I remember one little girl who was having a lot of abdominal pain and pain in her joints, and her mother was thinking of homeschooling her. And I mean, this is unusual. I wish my job was always this easy and I could help this many people this quickly, but just literally one session of talking through the pain cycles and actually how it's important not to focus on pain. Otherwise, pain would start to, beat her, and having some rewards for that at home. They literally came back the next session and said the pain was gone. Other kids with EDS, often might give them a metaphor or a way of thinking about pain, like who's on their side against the pain, or it might be a superhero who, it might be all the people in their family and school that are on their team, and children are so suggestible that actually they start to have beliefs about actually it's really good to cope with pain, and every time I do my activity despite pain, that's a great thing. They can have really quite marked effects. Also, some adults I see, some people get a lot from hypnosis. I would say with hypnosis, there's a minority that get huge effects, and then there's sort of a larger group who get some effects if they practice it a lot, and some people don't get anything from hypnosis. So there's some people who make huge changes. I would say it's all about what's causing the pain. If it's muscle strength, then maybe muscle strength would help. If actually for some people stress is having a really big effect, maybe that could help. For other people, there's so much going on physically from an EDS point of view that their best goal might be about coping with it differently. I think it's different for everyone.
And I can just say from personal experience, I think it's important to also remember the difference between saying it can cure it or make it go away. No one ever claims that it can. It's about being able to manage those symptoms better, which makes everything feel a bit more easier to cope with. And I've certainly, my life has changed, and I seem to, even though what's going on with my body is worse than when I was younger, I feel much better because of the tools I have with coping with it, with my mind, and making little shifts. You'll see I'm leaning on this, standing on here. You can make really small adjustments physically, but there's such a huge amount that can come with making adjustments mentally as well. And I think people get threatened by that when they hear that, because it's like you're saying, oh, just do a bit of mindfulness and it will cure your EDS. It won't. It's getting over that it's not curative, but it really is one of the best management tools that you can have, and I think that's my experience, and I'm sure that you agree from your clinic.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head with mindset. People always say to me, what techniques can you give me? Or parents will say to me, and I think the more I've worked more and more, I think so much is about mindset. We can go back to that CBT cycle, that's maybe another way of framing it, but it's about, I suppose, the mindset that people fall into when they have chronic symptoms is 100% understandable. But it's just, is that the mindset you want to have? And how can you maybe get there?
And how do you see the growing role of health coaches collaborating with providers, aiding those in chronic pain like in EDS? What's your opinion on that?
So we don't necessarily have health coaches in the UK at the moment, but I think anyone that can help, absolutely. I mean, coaching tends to be very solution focused, very sort of, let's look into the here and now with some specific goals. Let's look at how you can change some very specific things. It never kind of really goes near therapy. And I think, that could be amazing for lots of people. I think as, some physios are doing a little bit of CBT, helping patients in the moment when they're doing an exercise and they find they really can't, saying to them, what's going through your mind right now? Okay, I'm going to damage myself. This isn't going to work. What's the point? This is my last hope. I don't want to do his physio in case it is my last hope and it doesn't work, all these things. So I think the more that we can, patients can get help from those around them, I think that's amazing, yeah.
Awesome. 1 minute left for one more question. Do you have any opinions on neurofeedback?
So is that sort of like biofeedback, are you thinking?
That's all I have, unfortunately.
Okay. So if it's what I understand, like biofeedback, which would be ways of physiologically measuring, say, like the body's stress response, for example. So it might be galvanic skin response. It might be, looking at the amount of sweat in your fingers. There's little electrode things you can put on, or looking at heart rate. I really like the idea. I think it can be really useful for people to actually get a number, or to see like when their heart rate is up, and to see when they're a bit stressed, and most importantly then to see, well, okay, what brings it down? I know for me, some of the things that will bring mine down might be different to somebody else. However, when I bought these things, they haven't seemed to work very well. So that's my honest opinion right now. But hopefully, as the technology gets better, it will change. And I suppose it's one of those things, the more money you pay, the better device you get. So, but I think, it's a really good option for the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.